Hello and welcome to the Political History of the United States. Episode 4.46, Brandywine and Germantown. Last time, we spent our episode getting everybody into place. In the north, we see the American army under Horatio Gates, preparing for their confrontation with Burgoyne's army near Bemis Heights. Further south, General Howe's army had, to the surprise of everybody, taken a long route down to the Chesapeake, and were now moving towards Philadelphia, where Washington intended to do what he could to stop Howe's advance. This week, we are going to leave everybody in a state of limbo up north, and focus specifically on the actions of Washington's army. I do, however, want you all to keep in mind that the events that we are talking about this week and the events that we are going to be discussing next time when we move back to the north do include a large amount of overlap with each other. If you will recall from our last episode, General Howe had been moving at something of a glacial pace as he marched towards Philadelphia. Having moved south from New York, Howe had initially planned on entering the Delaware River and taking that path towards the American capital. However, upon learning that the Americans had taken steps to defend the river, Howe opted to move further south and land in the Chesapeake. Though it did ensure an easier landing, it meant that his men, who were tired from weeks at sea, were now also going to be facing a daunting march towards Philadelphia. Washington, having ample time to prepare for the British arrival, had chosen a location along the east bank of Brandywine Creek to make his stand. The river acted as something of a natural choke point, as it could only be crossed at a handful of fords. Washington placed Nathanael Greene in the center to protect the main crossing point at Chad's Ford. The left side of the line was given to John Armstrong, with John Sullivan and Lord Stirling taking the right. The bulk of the army was with Greene in the center at Chad's Ford, as that was going to be directly along the British path towards Philadelphia. Washington, who had been doing whatever he could to avoid a general engagement, believed that this, right now, was a good time to act. His men were well rested as compared to Howe's, who had just taken that arduous trip by sea from New York, and now were following it up with that long march. In terms of numbers, Howe had a slight numerical advantage, with around 13,000 men under his command, as compared to Washington's 11,000. Washington believed, from the intelligence that he was receiving from Chad's Ford, that this was the place where the British would make their crossing. There were two additional fords that Washington was aware of, one to the south that was protected by Armstrong, and Painter's Ford that was defended by Sullivan. The problem was that despite the intelligence reports that Chad's Ford was the only place that the British could realistically cross, there were other potential fords further to the north. The Americans, therefore, were in a situation that was weirdly reminiscent of Long Island. The northern flank of the American line, the one controlled by John Sullivan, was unprotected, thus leaving this part of the line dangerously exposed. Sullivan was not exactly Washington's favorite general, and in fact, he was having a pretty rough go of things. So far, we have seen him suffer a major loss in Canada. We saw him getting outflanked on Long Island. He had, just a few months earlier, led an unsuccessful, and unauthorized, raid on Staten Island that had resulted in more than 150 casualties. And now, here he was once again in danger of getting outflanked. Politically, however, Washington had few options. He could not easily replace Sullivan, who did have friends in high places, nor could he allow a subordinate of Sullivan to take command, as it would risk other officers objecting to the slight. Instead, Washington stuck Sullivan to a part of the line that he believed, again from the intelligence that he was receiving, to be safe and mostly out of the action. Well, there was some logic behind this plan. Howe, as it would turn out, was not the biggest fan in the world of throwing himself down the center of a frontal attack. He well remembered Bunker Hill, and was not terribly interested in repeating it. At around 5 a.m. on September 11th, Howe presumably gave Washington exactly what he wanted, sending a column directly at Chadds Ford. Exactly as expected. Unfortunately for Washington, however, Howe had become aware that there was additional crossing points. Although the most immediate action was happening near Chadds Ford, as predicted, Washington was seemingly unaware that a second column, led by Cornwallis, was going on a long march to the north. The plan here called for Cornwallis and his column to cross the river twice, both at Timbals and then later at Jeffreys Ford, with plans to then move back towards the south and slam into the unexpected northern part of the American line. It was not until around 11 a.m. that Washington would learn about this second line, as information came to him that an army of some 5,000 were indeed marching towards the north, and that they were going to try to outflank Sullivan. Washington, receiving this information, just blew it off entirely. Now, there are some reasons for Washington seemingly disregarding this information. First, there is the possibility that the Americans had just suffered an outright intelligence failure, and that Washington was unaware of the crossing further along the river. Even if this is not true, however, and Washington had been aware of the crossing, one can only spread their army so thinly. Presumably, there will always be another crossing, just a little further along. Cornwallis did not cross either at the first unguarded ford, but instead he would make his crossing at the second unguarded crossing point. Although Washington did ignore the information when he first received it that morning, it is also important to understand that he was getting multiple, often contradictory reports. Following that initial report, Washington showed a painful stab of that indecisiveness that had been a problem for him before. Upon hearing of the army approaching from the north, he was easily able to discount it because he simply did not believe that the British were going to take such a long route to outflank him. Washington does seem as though he did briefly reconsider the intelligence, debating making a stab of his own across Chadds Ford, thinking, as it would turn out correctly, that if there was a British army moving north, he held a numerical advantage in the center. However, almost immediately after giving Greene the order to advance, he reversed course. He had gotten word from Sullivan that there was no outflanking mission taking place, so he called off the push through the center. Having doubted the intelligence in the first place, and now getting that contradictory information from Sullivan, Washington was not about to risk his army on a forward assault against what he assumed to be Howe's entire army. Ironically, as Nathaniel Greene biographer Terry Galway points out in his book, Washington's Generals, had Washington proceeded to advance forward at Chadds Ford, it may well have turned the tide of the battle and given the Americans a much-needed victory. Cornwallis was indeed in the middle of an outflanking action, meaning that the Americans were stronger in the center than the British across from them. Washington, however, just did not have the confidence that such an attack was coming, especially with that report from Sullivan, which is why he called off the attack. The American line was holding the center nicely, and presumably that was going to be the focal point of the British assault. That is, right up until 2 p.m., when Washington received a report confirming that the British had indeed taken that long and winding path, and that, just as in Long Island, John Sullivan had now been outflanked. The Continental Army was now suddenly looking at the very real risk of an absolute catastrophe. To the right of Sterling, the furthest part of the American right flank, stood Osborne's Hill. At around 3 in the afternoon, Cornwallis took the hill and began his assault on Sullivan and Sterling's men. Now, thankfully for the Americans, the British moved with enough deliberation in getting organized and stopping for rest and food after such a long march that it bought the Americans much-needed time to turn and face the threat, rather than Cornwallis moving quickly down and overwhelming the surprised Americans. Once they were ready, the British opened up with a brief artillery barrage, before advancing down the hill towards the American positions. Had Sullivan's army quickly become overwhelmed, and the British had managed to break through the American lines, there was a very substantial risk of the army quickly becoming enveloped. Cornwallis would have been able to swing around the American rear and trap the Americans between the two armies at Chad's Ford. For all the criticisms that we have handed John Sullivan throughout this podcast, he did perform well on this day. His army was able to, at the very least, stand and fight, rather than crumbling under the British pressure. Washington, finally realizing that the move on the center was a feint, and that the bigger army was the one attacking on his flank, shifted Greene from the center off to reinforce Sullivan. Greene, in an impressive feat, moved his army nearly 5 miles in just 45 minutes. Despite the admirable defense by Sullivan, there were problems. The most pressing issue is that when Sullivan, Sterling, and Colonel Adam Stephen got into position, they had left several sizable gaps in their lines that the British were quickly able to exploit. By the time that Greene and his men had arrived, there was no meaningful hope left for the Americans when it came to winning the battle. Rather, his men were just able to plug up those gaps and slow down the British advance. What ensued was a brutal battle for both armies, as the Americans desperately tried to keep from being overrun by the British. Although moving Greene and his men from the center to the right had helped stave off disaster, it came at the unavoidable cost of fatally weakening the American center. With Greene now off dealing with Cornwallis, the defense of the center was in the hands of Anthony Wayne. Now, although the center had been significantly weakened, Wayne did not merely step aside and allow the British to cross. Rather, he stood his ground and his men fought bravely, making sure that the British paid for every single inch that they gained. By this point, however, darkness was overtaking the battlefield, and fighting was drawing to a close, as the Americans managed to retreat. The Battle of Brandywine was a loss for Washington's army. The British had won the day, and the Americans were forced to retreat. However, in what seems to be something of a trend, Brandywine could have been so much worse for the Americans. Washington had failed to take precautions to protect his right flank. Had Sullivan not held on for as long as he had, if Anthony Wayne had not stood and fought in the center, had Greene and his men not covered 5 miles in just 45 minutes, the American army may well have been encircled, and the army dealt a catastrophic loss, which they may not have been able to bounce back from. However, the Continental Army had managed to retreat, and although Howe had won the day, he still had Washington's army between him and his target of Philadelphia. The British had lost around 500 during the battle, with American losses roughly double that. The Americans had also lost critical supplies and artillery during their retreat. Following the defeat, Washington dispatched Henry Lee, the father of Robert E. Lee, and Alexander Hamilton to go out and burn flour mills along the Schuylkill River, to, hopefully, make the seemingly inevitable British march to the city that much more difficult. During this mission, a small skirmish broke out when Lee and Hamilton ran into a small British patrol. In the ensuing fight, Hamilton very nearly drowned in the river. Lee, thinking that Hamilton did indeed die, reported to Washington that the young man had drowned. Washington was very relieved when, shortly thereafter, the still very much alive Hamilton walked into the room. The battle would also forge a lifelong friendship between Washington and the Marquis de Lafayette. Washington had already been bristling under the number of foreign officers being thrown at him, having no commands to hand out and being resistant to the idea of giving commands to foreigners, something that we have talked about before. In the instance of Lafayette, Congress was anxious to make him happy for a few reasons. Mostly because the Americans wanted a French alliance and he was well connected to a powerful French family. Plus, it did not hurt that Lafayette was really, really, really rich. To show the Marquis just how much they appreciated him, they bestowed him the rank of Major General. Lafayette, pleased with his rank, then made his way to Washington and asked where his men were. Washington, confused and with no men to give, wrote back to Virginia Congressman Benjamin Harrison for clarification on exactly what Congress was thinking. Washington, to be perfectly clear, was thoroughly annoyed by this point. Harrison, however, reassured him that such an appointment was merely honorific. To his credit, Lafayette took it well and was honored to accept a spot amongst Washington's military family. Their relationship would be further reinforced when Lafayette showed his bravery during the Battle of Brandywine and ended up getting shot in the leg. Lafayette would write home to his wife, Adrienne, assuring her that his wound was really nothing and that he had not even noticed it. He assured his, understandably nervous spouse that the surgeons were astonished by just how fast he was healing. As bad as things could have been at Brandywine, the Americans had survived the day without really that much in the way of negative repercussions. Yes, they had lost the battle, and indeed casualties had been high. But the army was not in any worse of a place than it had been before. Washington's men had not been surrounded, and strategically, they were still in between Howe and Philadelphia. The losses were never great, of course, but Washington was able to call on some 2,500 reinforcements by moving men around and requesting additional militia from nearby states. Just 2 weeks after the battle, Washington had recouped his losses. The weeks right after the events at Brandywine did not see another major engagement, but did see plenty of maneuvering from both the British and the Continental Army alike. This led to several smaller skirmishes, which broke out as scouts and advance parties from both sides frequently collided. Now, I'm not going to go through every single skirmish, as that would be overwhelming. However, I do want to focus on one in particular that happened in the early morning hours of September 21st, in the town of Paoli, Pennsylvania. Located not far from Valley Forge, a detachment of American troops under the command of Anthony Wayne was making camp at Paoli. The group had been given the job of mostly just harassing Howe and his men on their march, taking their shots where they could get them. On this particular night, however, Wayne was careless and failed to set up his own patrols. Howe learned of the existence of the army through a mixture of both captured Americans and loyalists, and therefore knew exactly where Wayne was holding up. Late that night, under the command of British Major General James Gray, the British walked into Wayne's camp and, using their bayonets, killed some 300 sleeping Americans. Although Wayne survived, his meager defense was only able to kill 8 British soldiers. In the aftermath of the attack, Anthony Wayne would write to Washington demanding a court-martial, as he attempted to vindicate himself for the loss. You likewise see Washington himself trying to smooth over the defeat. On September 22nd, Hamilton wrote to John Hancock assuring him that the loss was minor, and that, critically, it came as a result of poor intelligence, rather than blaming it on any single individual. With his rear now secure, Howe would move quickly to take advantage. He quickly marched far up the Schuylkill, baiting Washington into following. Washington obliged and was taken for surprise when Howe quickly reversed course and moved right past him into Philadelphia itself. As devastating as the loss of the American capital might seem, it was not exactly a surprising development. For the last year, everybody had been waiting for it, so it didn't really come as a shock. Despite the loss, Washington himself had reasons to be happy. First, he was still not done with his own campaign season, and he had hope that he would be able to still deliver another blow or two to the British. Furthermore, right at about the same time that Philadelphia was being captured, the first bit of good news started rolling in from the north, a topic that we're going to discuss next time. Although Howe had captured Philadelphia, it did not mean that holding the city was going to prove to be a pleasant task. The Americans were still in control of the Delaware, making Howe's task of getting supplies into the city much more difficult. Ironically, the capture of the city brought a small amount of political stability over Pennsylvania. For the last year, there had been ongoing battles over the state constitution, a constitution that many viewed as being dangerously democratic. The opposition to this constitution was led by conservative congressmen, men like John Dickinson and Robert Morris. The capture of the city, however, poured cold water, if only temporarily, on their objections to the new constitution. Not completely comfortable with the conditions inside of the city, and with the resistance to him holding it, Howe chose to move 9,000 of his men off to Germantown, some 5 miles north of the main city. Howe then moved another 2,000 to a location 12 miles south of the city, and yet another 3,000 to Elktown in the east. Elktown became critical, as, with the Delaware firmly ensconced in American hands, it became a pivotal supply route for the occupying British. These actions meant that Howe, rather than being able to concentrate his forces in Philadelphia, had to spread himself out in order to protect his newest holding. For George Washington, he believed that this provided him with an opportunity to strike. Washington placed his sights on Germantown, where 9,000 of Howe's men were now placed. A fan of the complex mission, Washington planned for a 4-columned attack on the British position, entering on the 4 roads in and out of town. The 2 coming from the north of Germantown were to attack the British flanks, while those from the south were to crash into the British rear. This was all set to go down at exactly 5 a.m. on October 4th, with all the troops moving at once with bayonet attacks. Washington would accompany Sullivan on the right, Nathanael Greene would command the left, with John Armstrong and William Smallwood. In traditional fashion, the Americans would begin with a long march the night before to get into position for the early morning assault. If you are sitting there and thinking that this all sounds really, really complicated and that there is no way that the Americans are going to pull it off, well, then you would be correct. The mission was almost guaranteed to be a failure. Even today, a 4-column synchronized attack is not going to be an easy task, and certainly, in 1777, it was not any easier. Hoping to inspire his men, Washington reminded everybody that they did not want all of the glory going to the Northern Army that was busy making waves at Saratoga. On the night of the battle, there were difficulties from an abnormally thick fog and poor maps, as had been the case a year earlier when Washington had made his way across the Delaware. Everybody was running late. Greene did not arrive until 45 minutes after the fighting had begun, after he had gotten lost, moved roughly 4 miles in the wrong direction, and then had to backtrack. Despite the attempts of the Americans to surprise the British, Howe was not in for an unwelcome shock. With the Americans having now arrived and forming ranks for their bayonet charge, the British opened up fire. However, despite all of the problems, things still looked pretty good. The American lines were holding together well, and the British were slowly but surely losing ground. Yeah, it would have been great if Greene had made it to the party on time, but his fashionably late arrival meant that the largest column was arriving at a moment when the Americans were holding their own. Surely, with Greene now having shown up, the Americans would be able to punch their way right through the British lines and march on to glory. The conditions for the fight on that morning were less than ideal. A heavy fog hung over the field, something that would cause much confusion. Prior to the battle, the fog would partly lead to the delays that we see, as men like Nathanael Greene inadvertently took the wrong roads. However, even once the battle began, the fog failed to lift. The battle had largely shifted towards a location known as the Chew House, so named for its owner, Benjamin Chew. It was at Chew's house that the British would establish their lines, forcing the Americans to attack the surprisingly sturdy structure. Henry Knox, bringing up the artillery, did all he could to blow the house down. However, the cannonballs just bounced off the stone structure. As an interesting aside, should you be in the area, you can visit the Chu house to this day. There is still visible damage from Knox's attempts to blast the house into rubble. As the battle raged for control over the location, an unfortunate incident would occur when some in Greene's army, under the command of Andrew Stephen, disobeyed orders and broke off to move towards the action. With the foggy conditions, all they could make out were some obscure figures off a little ways in the distance. Seeing this group that they had come across, they decided to open fire. Unfortunately, those obscure troops off in the distance were not British soldiers, but rather a command under Anthony Wayne. Wayne, who now found himself suddenly under attack, ordered his men to turn and return fire. Neither side could see much through the fog, a fog that was now being reinforced with smoke from muskets and artillery. The men under Greene, specifically General Muhlenberg, fought well, and ultimately they were able to take nearly 100 British prisoners. However, even by this point, it was growing increasingly likely that the Americans were not going to win the day. As a result of the late arrival by Greene, it meant that he was significantly behind everybody else. Although he commanded the largest part of the American army, he now found himself largely fighting alone, and his manpower advantage no longer was present. In fact, he was now the one who was outnumbered. When the British launched their own counterattack against Greene, he had little choice but to fall back. Meanwhile, over on the right, John Sullivan's men had been fighting bravely. However, an unexpected bayonet attack had taken them by surprise, causing the men to quickly turn and run. Now, here again, the fog played a deciding role, allowing the British to get much closer to the American lines before those same Americans had any idea that the British were charging. Between those unexpected bayonet charges and Stephen firing on Wayne's men, the American lines suddenly began to crumble. Following hours of bravely fighting and indeed pushing the British back, suddenly it was the Americans who were in retreat. Although Washington raced out, exposing himself to enemy fire, and tried to turn the men back around, it was a fruitless effort. With little he could do, and realizing that despite being so tantalizingly close, the Americans were not going to take the day, Washington ordered a general retreat. Although Cornwallis did make some overtures towards pursuing the retreating Americans, it was a half-hearted effort, and more so was to ensure that the Americans were indeed pulling back. As the Continental Army marched away from Germantown, with their leadership surely wondering what might have been, they were doing so with nearly 1,000 casualties, including over 150 dead and 400 captured. The number of British wounded and killed was only marginally less than the Americans. However, Washington's men failed to take any prisoners. Germantown had very nearly been a success for the Americans. Sure, there had been some questionable decisions by the leadership, like getting bogged down at Chu House instead of just trying to move around it. But the Americans had very nearly won the battle. What followed in the weeks after Germantown was an attempt by Washington to make things in Philadelphia as miserable as possible. The Continental Army kept tight control over the river, and although the British would ultimately get control over it, it would come at a very steep cost. Washington did briefly flirt with the idea of an assault on the city. However, his generals were very clear that this was a bad idea, discouraging the general from foolishly risking his army for a plan with little to no chance of success. Washington spent the next several months eager to act, itching to prove himself up to the challenge that Congress had invested into him back in 1775. Howe, who himself wanted to pull the Americans into a fight that might destroy the rebel army before the end of the year, moved to within a mile of the American position at White Marsh, 8 dozen or so miles from Philadelphia. He attempted to trick the Americans by sending a column out towards the American right, hoping to trick them into believing that he was again attempting to outflank them, although the plan was for the real attack to come from the left. It was a smart move by Howe. Twice now Washington had been outflanked, and Howe knew that Washington could well fall into the trap of exposing his left, as he desperately tried to reinforce the right. To his credit, however, Washington was not taking the bait. As soon as Howe realized that Washington was not going to fall for it, he decided to withdraw, thus ending his 1777 campaign season. 1777 had been a strange year in some ways for George Washington. In terms of wins and losses, well, the record does not look that impressive. In some ways, the fact that the Americans had real chances at victory, both at Brandywine and Germantown, made those losses look both simultaneously better and worse. Worse because the Americans truly could have taken the day had things played out just a little bit differently. Better because even though Washington had lost, his men had proven their ability to stand and fight bravely. They had proven that, but for some unfortunate circumstances, there was at least a scenario where they could defeat a professional British army in open battle. The Continental Army had taken significantly more losses than the British, and nobody could deny that Washington had raised a few question marks. But the army was very much intact at the end of the campaign season, and had shown that they could at least hang with the British. Events to the north had also changed. We are going to talk exclusively about Saratoga next time. However, I will say now that Washington certainly was feeling a good dose of pressure from the congressional leadership as well. Horatio Gates suddenly found his star burning blindingly bright, whereas Washington was fighting to maintain his luster. In November, Dr. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, wrote several times to John Adams, extolling the leadership of Gates, while simultaneously talking about the miserable conditions inside of Philadelphia. Rush mentions at one point that he went to see Washington and was able to ride right up to him without the slightest bit of interest, something that deeply concerned him. It is not hard to see in these letters that Rush had growing doubts about Washington, and he was not alone. Washington's eagerness to pick a fight following Germantown, one that his officers were able to talk him out of, shows just how desperate the American general was to prove himself. Washington had wanted to enter winter quarters further from Howe's army. However, Congress was worried that by completely abandoning Philadelphia, it would allow the British free rein to abuse the inhabitants stuck in the captured city. As a result, Washington elected to remain nearby the city, and on December 19th, he entered into his winter lodging at Valley Forge. Although the fight for Washington is now done in 1777, we are not yet done with this year. We still have a lot to get to for 1777, including checking in with Congress and seeing what they have been up to. However, before we can do that, or really even evaluate fully Washington's year, we must first bring the fighting for the year to a close. Next time, we head back north as the Americans under Horatio Gates face off for a defining battle against John Burgoyne near Saratoga. Until then, I hope you all have a fantastic 2 weeks. I hope that you are staying healthy and that you are staying safe. And I will see you back here next time for the Battle of Saratoga.